The autumn twilight over Fairfax County, Virginia, descended with a deceptive, amber-drenched grace, settling softly across the manicured lawns and towering oak trees of the Sterling estate. Inside the 4-bedroom colonial home that Clara Sterling had spent the past 14 years meticulously curating, the air hummed with the polite, hollow laughter of retired executives and suburban acquaintances gathered to celebrate Arthur Sterling's departure from corporate life. Clara moved through the gathering with practiced serenity, her hands smoothing the linen tablecloths and arranging crystal glassware, though her muscles remained coiled with a familiar, low-grade tension. For months, she had orchestrated this evening as a tribute to her father-in-law's legacy, masking the deep fractures running beneath the surface of the family with hospitable warmth. Yet, beneath the veneer of suburban perfection, the atmosphere was suffocating, thick with unspoken expectations and the subtle, biting weight of generational condescension. As Clara stepped onto the back patio to check on the refreshment tables, the cool evening air offered a brief respite from the stifling chatter indoors. It was here, amidst the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive aged bourbon, that the evening's delicate equilibrium began to fracture. Her mother-in-law, Victoria Sterling, materialized beside her like a specter of uncompromising judgment, her sharp eyes scanning Clara's attire with a thinly veiled sneer. Victoria, a matriarch who wielded her husband's wealth and social standing like a medieval broadsword, wasted no time before launching her assault. With a voice dripping in aristocratic disdain, she pivoted the conversation away from the retirement celebration and toward Clara's service in the Army Reserve, framing it not as a noble commitment, but as a bizarre, unfeminine hobby that embarrassed the family name. The words cut through the festive noise, reminding Clara of the invisible glass ceiling she had fought against for years, one constructed not by the military, but by the very family into which she had married. The verbal fencing match escalated swiftly from private jabs to a public spectacle, as Victoria drew a tight circle of curious guests into their orbit, ensuring her dominance was broadcasted to the entire assembly. Raising her voice just enough to pierce the ambient murmur of the party, Victoria's gaze dropped pointedly to the emerald silk dress Clara wore, remarking with venomous sweetness that it was a luxury funded entirely by Julian's hard-earned corporate salary, as if Clara were a charity case living off the grace of the Sterling men. Before Clara could formulate a defense, Victoria turned her attention downward, addressing 4-year-old Leo, who was innocently clutching a juice box near his grandmother's knee. With a chilling smile designed to poison the boy's developing worldview, Victoria whispered a calculated directive intended to echo through generations. "Look at your mother, darling. One day, you'll grow up and understand that your father is the pillar who carries this entire household on his head, while the women merely decorate the margins." A suffocating hush seemed to fall over the immediate vicinity as the cruelty of the statement sank in, leaving Clara's breath trapped painfully in her throat. Her eyes immediately darted toward the stainless steel built-in grill a few yards away, where her husband Julian stood tending to the flames with an absurd, obsessive intensity. Julian was deliberately avoiding eye contact, his broad shoulders hunching inward as he pretended to be entirely absorbed in flipping medium-rare ribeye steaks, choosing the cowardice of comfortable silence over the defense of his wife and child. In that agonizing vacuum of accountability, Clara realized the true devastation of her marriage. Her husband's silence was not merely an avoidance of conflict. It was an active endorsement of her subjugation. The man she had loved, the partner who had once sworn to stand by her through every storm, had traded his spine for the quiet approval of a domineering mother, leaving Clara utterly alone in the battlefield of her own home. The internal dam that Clara had held back with superhuman restraint for years finally ruptured, releasing a tide of righteous indignation that could no longer be contained by polite suburban decorum. Stepping forward, her voice ringing out with the crisp, commanding authority of an officer who had commanded platoons, Clara looked directly at her mother-in-law and demanded an immediate cessation of the psychological manipulation directed at her son. "You will not poison my child's mind with your misogynistic poison, Victoria," Clara stated, her tone unyielding, steady, and devoid of the deference the matriarch expected. Instantly, the dynamics of the patio shifted with theatrical speed. Victoria's face crumpled into a mask of wounded martyrdom, her hand flying to her chest as she let out a theatrical gasp, instantly casting herself as the fragile victim of an ungrateful, aggressive daughter-in-law. The commotion drew Julian away from his grill at last. But instead of rushing to de-escalate the tension or addressing the psychological abuse his mother had just inflicted, his face flushed with a furious, humiliated crimson. Driven by a desperate need to restore his mother's fragile ego and appease the audience of onlookers, Julian stepped directly into Clara's personal space, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, unfamiliar hostility. The man she shared a bed with leaned down and delivered an ultimatum that tore the remaining shreds of their marriage to ash, his voice trembling with venom. "You have two choices right now, Clara. Either get on your knees and apologize to my mother for your appalling disrespect, or pack your bags and get the hell out of my life forever." The finality of his words hung in the autumn air like a guillotine blade, a brutal demand for absolute submission that left Clara with only one path forward with her dignity intact. Instead of shrinking under the weight of his ultimatum, a profound, crystal-clear calm washed over Clara, replacing her shock with the cold, calculated clarity of a strategist executing an extraction. Without shedding a single tear, she turned on her heel, swept upstairs into the nursery, and scooped a bewildered but sleepy Leo into her arms, whispering reassurances against his soft curls. In rapid succession, she tossed a few essential garments and legal documents into a weekend duffel bag, her movements efficient and devoid of hesitation, as the sounds of gasps and murmurs drifted up from the party below. She marched out the front door, bypassing the stunned crowd on the patio, and strapped Leo safely into his car seat in the back of her silver Porsche Cayenne, a vehicle she had purchased entirely with her own deployment savings and inheritance. As Clara slid behind the steering wheel and ignited the engine, the deep, guttural roar of the German-engineered V6 engine sliced through the quiet suburban night, serving as a visceral declaration of her reclaimed independence. Just as she shifted the gear into reverse, the silhouette of Victoria burst through the front doorway, sprinting down the cobblestone driveway with surprising speed. Her face contorted in furious disbelief as she realized the domestic servant was escaping her domain. Victoria hammered her fists against the rear passenger window, screaming at the top of her lungs that the Porsche belonged to the Sterling household and demanding Clara step out and leave the keys behind. Ignoring the hysterical shrieks echoing off the neighboring houses, Clara pressed her foot gently on the accelerator, steering the heavy SUV out of the gates and away from the gilded cage that had nearly broken her spirit. She drove directly to a secure, upscale boutique hotel in downtown Washington, D.C. And as soon as Leo was tucked safely asleep in the king-sized bed, she typed a single, emotionless text message to Julian, informing him of their location. The morning sun broke over the Potomac River, casting long, sharp beams of golden light across the minimalist suite where Clara and Leo had spent the night in profound, uninterrupted peace. At exactly 8 o'clock, while Clara was quietly helping her son pour milk into a bowl of cereal, the encrypted satellite phone on the mahogany desk chimed with an incoming call. It was Elena Vance, senior partner at Vance & Associates and one of the most formidable family law litigators in the Mid-Atlantic region, calling precisely on schedule. Clara answered on the first ring, listening calmly as Elena confirmed that the emergency custody filing and asset freeze injunctions had already been successfully transmitted to Julian's personal email and corporate office. For the first time in her life, Julian was forced to confront the unvarnished legal reality of his matrimonial obligations, stripped entirely of the protective cocoon his mother's wealth and social prestige had always provided. Miles away, in the Fairfax County kitchen, Julian stared down at his ringing smartphone and the legal documents flashing on his laptop screen, the color draining entirely from his face. As Elena Vance's calm, authoritative voice projected from the speakerphone. There was no mother standing beside him to whisper excuses, no social gathering to distract him from the impending catastrophe, and no way to minimize Clara's formidable resolve with a condescending smirk. He was forced to listen, word by agonizing word, to an exhaustive itemization of marital assets, hidden corporate accounts, and the absolute non-negotiability of joint custody. A terrifying awakening to the fact that his wife was not a subordinate to be managed, but an adversary of formidable intellect. As Elena curtly outlined the next steps for deposition and asset division, the fragile illusion of the Sterling dynasty shattered completely, leaving Julian to realize that his arrogance had just cost him everything that truly mattered. Long before Julian Sterling ever entered her world, Clara's life had been anchored by the resilient, calloused hands of her grandmother, Ruth, a woman who understood the fragile sanctuary of real estate security. During the tumultuous years of Clara's early childhood, when her own mother struggled continuously against the crushing undertow of alcohol addiction, Grandma Ruth had been the solitary rock of stability, raising her in a comfortable, creaking 1980s colonial home nestled in the heart of Virginia. When Ruth passed away when Clara was 23, she left behind an unencumbered property, completely free of mortgage debt, alongside a modest parcel of rural land outside Richmond that Ruth had acquired decades prior. 2 years following her grandmother's passing, anticipating the unpredictable tides of her future, and guided by an astute estate attorney, Clara made the pragmatic decision to sell the Richmond acreage, utilizing a portion of the proceeds to purchase her certified pre-owned Porsche Cayenne. She selected the luxury SUV not for status or pretense, but because its mechanical reliability and structural safety ratings offered the perfect vessel for the family she hoped one day to build. Every single legal document, from the historical deed of the Fairfax County colonial to the vehicle title of the Porsche, was executed and maintained exclusively in Clara's name alone, funded entirely by traceable inheritance monies that predated her marriage by years, structured precisely to protect her independent sovereignty against unforeseen marital storms that might later arise in life. Later that afternoon, as the initial shock of the legal notice subsided into a quiet, simmering realization, Julian placed a trembling, reluctant phone call back to Clara's private hotel line. Stripped of the protective physical audience of his mother and colleagues, his voice cracked with a mixture of profound exhaustion and lingering defensive panic as he attempted to explain the unexplainable. Prompted by Elena Vance's firm legal boundaries, Julian finally confessed the pathetic psychological architecture behind his monumental deception, a fragile web spun from the deep, festering insecurities of his childhood. Growing up, he had lived perpetually in the shadow of his older brother, Lucas, a brilliantly successful cosmetic dentist in Maryland, whose multi-million-dollar lifestyle was weaponized by Victoria as the absolute gold standard of human worth. Julian had grown utterly exhausted by the relentless, humiliating comparisons regarding income, vacations, and real estate portfolios, desperate for a sliver of maternal validation. Thus, during the early months of their courtship, when Victoria had marveled at Clara's inherited colonial home, Julian had simply nodded and accepted the misplaced praise, lying that he had purchased the property himself just before their wedding day. He had rationalized the falsehood as a harmless white lie to buy peace, convincing himself that a strong marriage did not require public credit, while secretly building an inflated version of himself, using his wife's private inheritance as an unshakable shield. The confession, however, grew infinitely darker and more convoluted as Julian unraveled the hidden promises he had made behind Clara's back to secure his mother's fragile illusion of dominance. Several months prior, during a family dinner where Arthur and Victoria had begun anxiously discussing downsizing after retirement, Julian had casually offered them a permanent solution, without ever consulting his wife. He had promised his parents that they could eventually move into the sprawling downstairs guest suite of Clara's Fairfax County home once they sold their older property, assuring them it would be a seamless transition. To cement this unauthorized arrangement and prove his fictional financial provider status to his father, Julian had secretly accepted $5,000 in cash from Arthur and Victoria, ostensibly earmarked as a construction deposit to renovate the guest suite to their exact specifications. That insidious financial transaction explained the terrifying, blinding entitlement with which Victoria had marched down the driveway, demanding the house and screaming for the keys. She genuinely believed her family had legally invested in the property. Julian had traded his wife's boundaries and legal ownership rights for a handful of silver coins, selling out their marital trust to manufacture a counterfeit image of a dutiful, successful son capable of rescuing his aging parents from financial distress without his wife's knowledge or consent. The final, devastating blow to whatever microscopic fragments of trust remained in the marriage arrived late that evening when Clara requested a comprehensive forensic audit of their combined financial records from the past 16 months. As she sat at the sleek mahogany desk in her hotel room, scrolling through endless digital PDF statements, a sickening pattern of hidden transactions caught her trained eye near the bottom margin. Repeated, systematic electronic wire transfers had been quietly siphoning funds from their joint savings account, an emergency reserve built through a meticulous combination of both their salaries to safeguard Leo's future and cover structural home repairs. Over 16 months, in increments carefully disguised as $300 or $800 at a time, Julian had funneled a staggering total of $12,000 directly into his parents' personal bank accounts to subsidize their retirement living expenses. Some line items were blandly labeled as home maintenance, others as vehicle assistance, and several simply as Dad. All executed without a single word of discussion or approval from Clara. When Elena Vance reviewed the ledger the next morning, she didn't hesitate, explicitly warning Clara that under Virginia family law, these unauthorized outflows constituted a textbook case of the intentional dissipation of marital assets that a court would mandate him to repay in full. Swift and uncompromising in her execution, Clara immediately took decisive action to sever the financial arteries through which Julian had been funding his elaborate falsehoods. By noon, she had visited the local credit union, legally redirected 100% of her future civilian and military reserve salary into an isolated, individually named account, and placed a temporary administrative freeze on all shared credit lines. When Julian attempted to swipe his debit card at a local gas station later that afternoon and found it declined, the terrifying reality of his total financial displacement finally crashed down upon him. Realizing there was no longer a cushion of inherited wealth or marital leniency to catch his fall, Julian packed 2 suitcases of clothing into his sedan and voluntarily surrendered his house keys to Elena's office, choosing to rent a modest, furnished studio apartment located only 2 blocks away from Leo's preschool. Watching him carry his meager belongings out of the home where they had once envisioned growing old together was undeniably painful, a visceral reminder that the consequences of betrayal do not cease to hurt simply because they are entirely deserved. Yet, as Clara locked the front door behind him and listened to the profound, unbroken silence of her own home, she understood that genuine peace could never inhabit a space built upon stolen foundations and silent deceit. The heavy, suffocating silence of separation stretched across 4 tense, exhausting days until a completely unexpected phone call broke the stillness on a quiet Thursday evening. It was Arthur Sterling, her father-in-law, whose voice sounded noticeably older, weathered, and deeply troubled over the electronic connection as he requested a private conversation. Unlike his domineering wife, Arthur had always possessed a quiet, observant sense of integrity, and the legal documents served upon Julian had forced him to begin asking uncomfortable questions about the reality of his retirement living arrangements. He confessed that Victoria had been spinning frantic, defensive narratives to protect her own ego, but the mathematical discrepancies in Julian's financial explanations simply refused to add up under close scrutiny. Arthur proposed an immediate, structured family intervention held on neutral territory, inside the professional office of a family counselor he personally knew through his church community. However, he laid down one absolute, non-negotiable condition that proved his desire for genuine accountability. He refused to orchestrate a rescue mission or smooth over the cracks for his failing son. "If we do this," Arthur stated firmly, his voice laced with solemn exhaustion, "I will not speak for Julian, and I will not let him hide behind me. He must look you in the eye and confess every single lie with his own mouth, or this family is finished, once and for all." The following Tuesday afternoon, the family converged inside the deliberately stark, sterile counseling room, a neutral environment stripped entirely of familiar walls, comforting family photographs, or sentimental territory for anyone to claim as leverage. The space contained only 4 upholstered chairs, a modest box of tissues, and a profound, atmospheric tension that seemed to vibrate against the drywall. Victoria arrived carrying a thick, tabbed folder, her posture radiating an air of defensive indignation and absolute certainty that her son had been victimized by a cold, manipulative spouse. Before anyone else could even sit down or remove their coats, Victoria launched directly into a shrill, venomous accusation, pointing a shaking finger at Clara, while claiming that she was using deceitful legal maneuvers, military connections, and malicious trickery to seize her son's hard-earned property. Clara remained entirely silent, refusing to engage with her manufactured outrage or lower herself to a screaming match in front of others. With deliberate, calm precision, she reached into her leather briefcase, pulled out certified copies of Grandma Ruth's historical property deed, the vehicle title to the Porsche Cayenne, and the forensic bank statements detailing the $12,000 in covert wire transfers, and placed the unsealed stack squarely in the center of the wooden table, without uttering a single word to validate Victoria's unhinged claims in front of the counselor. The clinical silence that followed her quiet gesture was absolute, suffocating, and heavy with impending reckoning as all eyes shifted toward the center table. Arthur looked directly at his son, his weathered face hardening as he commanded in a low, authoritative tone. "You requested this meeting, Julian. The papers are right in front of you. Start talking right now." For several agonizing seconds, Julian remained completely frozen, his eyes glued to the scuffed gray carpet between his polished shoes, as though he wished the floor would open up and swallow him whole. When he finally raised his head, all the arrogant bluster and manufactured confidence had entirely evaporated from his posture, leaving behind the hollow shell of a man cornered by his own cowardice. In a fractured, barely audible whisper, Julian looked at his stunned parents and admitted the humiliating, unvarnished truth. The Fairfax County colonial home had belonged entirely to Clara. Before they ever met, purchased through her grandmother's inheritance. He choked out the confession that he had never paid a single dollar toward the mortgage or property taxes, that the Porsche Cayenne was bought with separate inheritance funds, and that the money he had funneled to his parents was stolen directly from their joint savings account behind Clara's back without authorization over 16 months. The emotional impact of his public confession hit Victoria with the devastating force of a physical impact, draining all the color instantly from her face as the horrifying reality set in. She slowly turned her disbelieving gaze toward her son, her voice cracking with profound betrayal as she whispered the words that captured the tragic absurdity of her own making. "You let me sit at that table and say those vicious things to her while you knew the absolute truth the entire time?" Julian swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively as he offered the most pathetic defense imaginable. Yes. When Victoria demanded to know why he would commit such an unforgivable betrayal, Julian stared down at his knees and uttered the final, damning explanation. "Because telling the truth would have exposed my failures to you." No one rushed to fill the heavy, agonizing silence that descended upon the room. Clara calmly slid the certified property deed and vehicle title across the polished wood toward her mother-in-law, watching her trembling fingers trace Clara's name printed alone on the legal documents. She looked them all in the eye and stated firmly that she was not there to steal anything from anyone, but simply to shatter the toxic architecture of lies that had sustained their family pride for years at her expense. Recognizing the structural collapse of her narrative, Victoria attempted to salvage her formidable pride through a defensive, heavily qualified concession that insulted Clara's intelligence. "Well," Victoria muttered, her chin trembling slightly as she crossed her arms tightly over her chest, "I suppose I am sorry if you somehow misunderstood what I meant back at the party." Clara did not let her off the hook with a polite nod, immediately correcting her manipulative framing with the uncompromising precision of an officer setting a boundary. "Do not invert the blame onto my perception, Victoria," she replied evenly, her voice cutting through the theatrical defense. "An authentic apology begins with naming the specific harm you caused, not questioning how I interpreted your deliberate insults." Arthur lowered his graying head in quiet shame, while Julian sat motionless, offering no further defense for his mother's evasive maneuvers. When the counselor gently asked what outcome Clara desired from the session, she stated clearly that she required the public lies to be corrected, the stolen funds fully accounted for, and a strict, unyielding protection for their son. Though Julian looked at her with a fragile, desperate hope of returning home immediately, Clara held his gaze without flinching, quietly informing him that the separation would continue indefinitely, while she evaluated if trust could ever be rebuilt from the ashes of deceit and betrayal. Julian sat beneath the amber glow of his office desk lamp, the silence of the midnight room broken only by the rhythmic clatter of his keyboard as he drafted a public letter to every branch of the extended family. For years, he had swallowed his mother's poison disguised as wisdom, nodding along as toxic whispers chipped away at the foundation of his marriage, paralyzed by a childhood conditioning that demanded absolute compliance in exchange for conditional affection. Now, driven by a fierce, awakened clarity, he stripped away every excuse, laying bare his complicity and officially correcting the malicious narratives his family had circulated about Clara. This confession was not merely an act of clearing his conscience. It was a profound declaration of loyalty, accompanied by a legally binding agreement to personally reimburse the $12,000 his mother had unjustly extracted from their joint savings, utilizing solely his private salary. To ensure this generational trauma ended with him, he officially enrolled in weekly psychological counseling, confronting the deep-seated childhood inadequacies that had once made him a bystander in his own home. In facing the dark mirrors of his past, Julian was finally shedding the fragile armor of his boyhood, stepping into the steady, protective light of a man willing to dismantle himself entirely to rebuild a sanctuary worthy of his wife and son. The autumn wind rattled the copper wind chimes on the front porch just moments before the aggressive, rhythmic pounding shattered the morning quiet, announcing the uninvited arrival of Victoria. Without so much as a courtesy knock, the older woman pushed past the garden gate, her posture rigid with entitlement as she marched toward the front door, demanding immediate access to her grandchild, expecting the familiar, trembling submission of the past. But the house did not yield to her command this time. Instead, the heavy oak door swung open to reveal Julian standing firmly in the threshold, his shoulders broad and his gaze steady, blocking her path with an unshakable, quiet authority. There was no hesitation in his voice, no tremor of the terrified boy who had spent decades seeking his mother's elusive approval, as he looked her dead in the eye and delivered a sentence that fundamentally rewrote the architecture of their family dynamics. "You are not welcome to enter Clara's home unless she explicitly invites you," he stated, his tone devoid of anger, yet absolute in its boundary, rendering Victoria momentarily speechless as she stared at the stranger her submissive son had finally evolved into. In that single, breathtaking moment of confrontation, Julian did not just protect a doorway. He stood as a living shield between the generational cruelty of the past and the sacred peace of the present, proving that true maturity is forged not in the absence of fear, but in the fierce, unwavering protection of those we love. Late that Tuesday afternoon, the quiet hum of Clara's phone broke with the arrival of an audio file, its duration stretching out to an astonishing 4 minutes and 12 seconds, an eternity in the digital age, sent by a woman who had never once uttered a sincere expression of regret. Clara pressed play, half expecting another wave of calculated manipulation or defensive justification. But instead, Victoria's voice emerged, stripped of its usual razor-sharp lacquer, trembling with a raw, unvarnished exhaustion. For 240 seconds, there were no excuses about maternal sacrifice, no gaslighting, and no attempts to soften her cruelty. Victoria systematically laid bare the malicious architecture of her own actions, confessing to the deliberate sabotage, the venomous whispers, and the calculated attempts to fracture a marriage she deemed beneath her social standing. A subsequent, heavily guarded meeting on a desolate park bench beneath the skeletal branches of November oaks finally laid bare the tragic architecture of Victoria's malice. A suffocating, paralyzing fear of a desolate, forgotten retirement, where her fading relevance drove her to claw desperately at the lives of her children to maintain a hollow sense of control. Looking at the frail, trembling woman sitting across from her, Clara felt the sharp edges of her own bitterness soften, not into forgiveness, but into a profound, aching pity for a soul so utterly impoverished by her own bitterness, realizing that cruelty is often just the desperate armor of a deeply terrified heart. Clara listened to the echoes of the 4-minute confession fade into the quiet room. Her heart neither hardened by resentment nor foolishly gullible in the glow of a sudden, convenient remorse. She accepted the apology as a necessary first step toward closure. Yet wisdom whispered that an apology is merely a bandage, not a cure, and true safety requires the construction of unyielding structural boundaries. Gathering her thoughts with the quiet grace of a woman who had walked through fire and learned the exact weight of her own worth, she established a rigorous, uncompromising protocol for any future interactions. Absolute prohibition of derogatory remarks regarding either parent in the presence of the children. Mandatory advance scheduling for any familial visits, and zero tolerance for emotional ambushes. She looked across the kitchen island at Julian, ensuring he understood that these were not petty instruments of retribution or weapons in a marital war, but rather the essential, non-negotiable safety conditions required to cultivate a tranquil environment where healing could finally take root. In drawing these sharp, protective lines, Clara taught her family a transformative lesson. Love may invite us to forgive, but true self-respect demands that we never mistake an open heart for an open door to our own destruction. The oak-paneled conference room smelled faintly of aged leather and fresh parchment, serving as the quiet theater where Clara and Julian chose to anchor their future not merely on the fragile promises of spoken affection, but on the unshakable bedrock of legal transparency. Guided by 2 independent, fiercely protective legal counsels, they meticulously drafted and signed the postnuptial agreement, a document that did not signal a lack of faith, but rather the supreme maturity of 2 people who understood that true love requires absolute safety and clarity. The clauses were carved with uncompromising precision. The historic family home and the independent business assets remained strictly categorized as separate, untouchable properties. Any financial allocation or gift directed toward extended family members required the explicit dual signature of both partners to prevent any future domestic friction. And every single line was drafted with the singular objective of providing an unbreachable fortress of security for young Leo. As the fountain pen scratched the final signature onto the heavy cream paper, a profound sense of weightlessness settled over the room. A realization that by letting go of romantic illusions and embracing practical accountability, They had built a sanctuary where love could breathe freely, protected forever from the bitter winds of financial anxiety and unspoken resentment. For 90 relentless days, Clara and Julian sat across from each other under the watchful, compassionate guidance of Dr. Fabian. Evelyn Carter, in her sunlit Bethesda marital counseling office, peeling back the layers of avoidance, fear, and unspoken resentment that had nearly destroyed their family. Dr. Carter did not offer cheap consolations or hurried shortcuts back to domestic bliss. Instead, she provided a rigorous, unflinching framework that forced Julian to confront the profound psychological cost of his chronic deception, and taught Clara how to dismantle her protective emotional fortress without compromising her self-respect. Through hours of grueling, emotionally raw dialogue, Dr. Carter introduced them to a foundational triad of recovery that ultimately became the guiding philosophy of their restructured relationship. Forgiveness is deeply personal. Unearned access is a hazard. And genuine trust is nothing more than accumulated evidence, gathered quietly over sustained periods of time. Julian learned to sit with the discomfort of his mother's disappointment without rushing to fabricate a comforting lie, while Clara discovered that true strength did not lie in punishing past failures, but in observing consistent behavioral shifts over time. They dissected the toxic mechanics of sibling rivalry and maternal enmeshment, slowly shedding the heavy psychological armor they had worn for years, until the sterile counseling room transformed into a sacred crucible where authentic accountability finally eclipsed the bitter memories of betrayal and silence once and for all. As the 90-day therapeutic milestone approached, their fragile equilibrium faced its most terrifying real-world crucible on a bright, breezy Saturday morning at a sprawling public park in Fairfax County, where they had gathered a wide circle of relatives to celebrate Leo's 5th birthday. Clara stood near the colorful cluster of helium balloons and picnic tables, feeling a sharp, familiar knot of anxiety twist in her chest as she watched members of Julian's extended family arrive with polite smiles and guarded, speculative glances that clearly remembered the fierce legal drama of recent months. Every instinct she possessed urged her to pack up the cupcakes, scoop Leo into her arms, and retreat to the safety of her unencumbered colonial home, fearing that a family gathering in a public space would inevitably trigger old dynamics and reignite dormant hostilities between them. Yet, looking down at Leo's radiant, excited face as he chased soap bubbles across the lush green grass, Clara made a conscious, courageous choice to anchor herself in the present moment, rather than the haunted shadows of yesterday. She realized that sheltering her son from every potential discomfort would teach him to live in perpetual fear, whereas demonstrating calm resilience in the face of social awkwardness was the greatest gift she could offer him. She took a deep, grounding breath, squared her shoulders, and committed herself to giving her little boy a joyful, unforgettable day untouched by the dark clouds of adult shame and lingering resentment. The fragile illusion of celebratory harmony shattered precisely midway through the afternoon, when Julian's younger sister, Chloe, a woman who had always thrived on family gossip and dramatic confrontation, stepped up to the picnic table with a sharp, predatory smile playing across her lips. Waiting for a moment when the surrounding relatives had quieted down to sing the traditional birthday song, Chloe leaned casually against the wooden bench and delivered a loud, weaponized barb designed to humiliate Clara in front of the entire assembly, without filter. "So, Clara," Chloe projected across the clearing with theatrical sweetness, her voice dripping with malicious curiosity. "Now that the legal dust has finally settled and the smoke has cleared, did you feel like a winner after winning the great family property war?" The cruel question struck the gathering like a physical shockwave, instantly draining the festive warmth from the air as dozens of pairs of judgmental eyes darted back and forth between Clara and Julian. Relatives dropped their paper plates and held their collective breath, waiting to see if Clara would ignite in fiery anger or retreat in wounded humiliation, while Chloe stood back with an arrogant, triumphant smirk, expecting her calculated provocation to successfully detonate the fragile piece and plunge the entire birthday celebration back into an explosive, toxic spectacle of familial warfare right in front of the children. Before Clara even had a chance to open her mouth or register the stinging insult, Julian stepped forward with a swift, decisive motion, his movements stripped entirely of the cowardly hesitation that had once defined his character during family crises. Without casting a nervous glance toward his mother or waiting for permission, he placed his paper plate down on the wooden bench, fixed his sister with a cold, unyielding stare, and delivered a public correction that left the entire assembly utterly speechless. "There was never any property war, Chloe," Julian stated clearly, his voice ringing across the park with absolute, uncompromising authority. "I lied. The house and the car were always Clara's separate property, and I am the one who lied, manipulated, and inflicted deep, undeserved pain upon my wife for years." As the heavy silence of profound shock blanketed the stunned relatives, Victoria suddenly intervened from the edge of the picnic area, her voice sharp and authoritative as she shut down her daughter's malicious attempt at drama. "That subject is permanently finished, Chloe," Victoria commanded, her stern gaze locking onto her daughter before turning toward Clara with a quiet, respectful nod of finality. Julian did not look at Clara, seeking validation for his defense. He stood tall in his truth, having finally learned that protecting his wife against familial cruelty was not a favor, but his fundamental, sacred duty as a husband and partner. The public display of unhesitating loyalty at the park acted as a powerful catalyst, providing Clara with the tangible, undeniable evidence she needed to finally begin considering a cautious, step-by-step path toward marital reconciliation. That very evening, after Leo had fallen fast asleep in his own bed, Clara and Julian sat together on the front porch under the gentle glow of the porch light to discuss what the future might hold for their fractured family. Clara acknowledged the profound significance of Julian's courage at the park, recognizing that he had finally learned to stand beside her rather than hiding behind silence. Yet, she remained firm in her commitment to proceed with absolute caution. They mutually agreed upon a slow, structured trial reconciliation, governed by strict, transparent boundaries. Julian would join them for family dinners twice a week and participate in weekend outings, but he would continue maintaining his separate rental apartment for the next 2 consecutive months. This deliberate probationary period ensured that any transition back into their home would be driven by sustained, verifiable personal growth, rather than emotional fatigue or romantic nostalgia. As Julian kissed her cheek gently and walked back toward his car, Clara watched him go with a quiet, grounded sense of hope, knowing they had chosen the long, arduous road of genuine healing over the comfortable illusion of pretense. For good. Following 2 consecutive months of a strict, meticulously observed trial reconciliation, during which Julian honored every single transparent boundary, participated in bi-weekly family dinners, and completed his individual therapy sessions with absolute dedication, Dr. Evelyn Carter officially signed off on a cautious, permanent transition back under the same roof. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon, Julian carried his remaining luggage back across the front threshold of the Fairfax County colonial home, his movements measured and respectful, entirely devoid of the entitled air he had worn for years before his awakening. Clara watched him place his suitcase in the master bedroom, feeling a profound, quiet stillness, rather than a sudden wave of blinding romantic euphoria, knowing deep within her soul that trust is never magically restored by the mere crossing of a doorway. Instead, the reconstruction of their marriage took shape through an accumulation of microscopic, unglamorous daily choices. Julian asking for permission before making household decisions, proactively managing his share of the domestic labor without needing gentle reminders, and reviewing their joint financial statements with absolute transparency every single weekend. He had finally relinquished his desperate need to perform as an infallible provider, choosing instead the quiet, enduring dignity of a partner who understood that true security is built exclusively on a foundation of unwavering accountability, mutual respect, and honest action, taken day after day without exception across their shared future. The ultimate testament to this hard-won domestic evolution materialized precisely 1 year to the day following Arthur's disastrous retirement cookout, as relatives once again gathered in the lush, sunlit backyard of Clara's home to celebrate the anniversary of a new beginning. The atmosphere this time bore no resemblance to the toxic, suffocating tension that had characterized the previous year's gathering. There were no passive-aggressive barbs whispered near the buffet table, no desperate competitions over manufactured corporate status, and no performative displays of fake supremacy. Instead, the air hummed with a gentle, organic harmony as family members naturally chipped in to prep the meal, with Julian manning the grill while quietly laughing alongside his father as they flipped burgers without a trace of performative anxiety. Arthur looked noticeably more relaxed, his eyes shining with quiet pride as he watched his son move through the yard with the grounded confidence of a man who no longer needed to hide behind a fictional persona to earn his place at the table. Even the food tasted different, not because the recipes had changed, but because every single person present was finally sharing a meal rooted in authentic truth, unburdened by the crushing weight of hidden debt, unspoken resentments, or the exhausting theater of perfectionism that had once kept them all trapped in a cycle of quiet desperation, year after year. The most striking manifestation of the family's profound transformation arrived mid-afternoon, when Victoria stepped out of her sedan near the front driveway, her posture carrying a subtle, humbling grace that Clara had never witnessed in all the years of their acquaintance. Rather than marching uninvited down the flagstone walkway, as she had always done in the past, Victoria paused respectfully at the garden gate, standing quietly until Clara happened to look up from the patio table and gesture an open-armed invitation for her to enter. Throughout the afternoon, Victoria's behavior remained impeccably measured and self-aware. She did not offer unsolicited parenting advice, did not disparage Clara's military reserve commitments, and did not attempt to monopolize Julian's attention with performative maternal displays. When she wished to take a photograph with 5-year-old Leo as he blew out a small cluster of celebratory cupcakes, she knelt down to his eye level and explicitly asked Clara for permission before snapping the picture with her phone, honoring the strict boundaries that had been established during their reconciliation. She had finally learned the agonizingly difficult lesson that a grandmother's place in a child's life is a privilege maintained through respectful conduct rather than an entitlement demanded by blood. Accepting her position as a guest in a home where she had once desperately fought to rule as an undisputed queen in her own mind, without question. Later in the afternoon, while the rest of the relatives drifted toward the front lawn to watch Arthur toss a miniature football with the older children, little Leo scampered over to the patio and scrambled happily up onto Clara's lap. Wrapping his small arms tightly around her neck, the boy looked toward his grandmother, who was sitting quietly across the table, before gazing up into Clara's eyes with a pure, innocent curiosity that cut straight to the core of truth. "Mommy," Leo whispered softly, his sweet voice carrying easily across the tranquil patio. "Does Grandma finally know whose house this really is?" Clara felt a warm, tender wave of emotion wash over her heart, and she pressed a gentle kiss to her son's dark curls before offering a reply designed to teach him the ultimate lesson in emotional intelligence and grace. "Yes, sweet boy, she knows," Clara answered calmly, her voice steady and clear as she met Victoria's tearful, repentant gaze across the wooden table. "But more importantly, Grandma knows this is your home, and the most wonderful rule we share here is that everyone inside these walls must treat one another with kindness, honesty, and mutual respect." Victoria lowered her head for a fleeting moment, blinking away a sudden tear of profound gratitude as she absorbed the magnificent, forgiving wisdom of the woman she had once so cruelly underestimated in the past. As the golden autumn sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, amber glow across the creaking 1980s colonial home that her grandmother Ruth had left behind, Clara sat back in her patio chair and surveyed the peaceful scene with a deep, unshakable sense of sovereignty. The Fairfax County Colonial and the Porsche Cayenne remained legally registered under her name alone, an unalienable separate property that protected her independent existence, yet she no longer viewed those legal deeds as weapons in an ongoing gender war. Her greatest victory was not that she had successfully defended her assets against a predatory marital dynamic, but that she had fiercely refused to teach her growing son the most destructive lesson of all, that keeping a family together requires a woman to sacrifice her self-respect and silently absorb humiliation. True reconciliation, she understood with crystal clarity, cannot be forged from the ashes of avoidance or built upon the stolen foundations of silent deceit, but must rise courageously from the uncompromising bedrock of truth, unyielding boundaries, and daily, unrelenting accountability. Looking across the yard as Julian smiled and waved toward her from the grill, Clara finally took a long, deep breath of pure, untainted peace, knowing that the sanctuary they had painfully rebuilt together was finally safe, whole, and enduringly real for the rest of their days together in this life.